Coast Guard cutter Ingham, one of 7 sister ships, was commissioned in 1936 at the Philadelphia Navy Yard on the same day that 3 of her sisters, which were built there, were christened. The others having been built in New York and Charleston. Of 327-foot length, 2,500 tons displacement, and capable of 25 knots, the ships during the Depression years of 1936 cost only $2.4 million apiece, and they were to last for an average of 50 years in the service of the country. The ships were designed using the plans of the 2 Navy gunboats, Charleston and Erie, which were built at the same time in Navy yards. In order to save planning effort and money, the same hull design and engineering plants were used in both classes, except that the 327 cutters had a cruiser-type stern. The superstructure on the 2 classes were entirely different, however, and the cutters carried 5-inch 51 guns, whereas the gunboats carried 6-inch guns. The 2 gunboats were overtaken by events and were never used for the purpose which they were intended. One was torpedoed early in the war in the Caribbean and beached and burned, and the other was in the Aleutians and saw very little action during the war. By contrast, the 327s had long and fruitful careers. With an increasing number of aircraft flying over water, the new 327s were designed to carry a float plane on a broad and spacious quarterdeck. At the time they were built, they were the smallest ships ever to carry a float plane as a part of the complement. Prior to that, the float planes had only been used on vessels of cruiser size and larger. The float planes were used extensively in Alaskan waters and in the Bering Sea patrols, and the Taney, based in Honolulu, used it in the Pacific area. In 1940, due to the outbreak of war in Europe, all of the 327s except the Taney were ordered to the Atlantic, and after Denmark fell and the Coast Guard was assigned the job of operating in Greenland and affording protection to that possession, the Duane was sent to Greenland with her float plane as shown here, and did extensive survey work on both coasts of Greenland, looking for possible locations for airfields and scouting for any sign of enemy activity. The 327s were among the finest seaboats ever built, able to take very heavy seas and without suffering damage due to their sturdy construction. Although only capable of 20.5 knots, while the destroyers with which he worked could do better than 30, when it came to heavy seas, the Ingham and her sisters could still do 18 to 20 knots, and the destroyers had to slow to 12 or 15 knots to keep from suffering severe structural damage. In 1941, Ingham, which had been operating out of Boston in the Western Atlantic, was ordered to Portugal, Lisbon, Portugal, to relieve her sister ship, the Campbell, and act as the American station ship in the only neutral port in that part of Europe. While in Lisbon, about 3 months before Pearl Harbor, the ship received a war warning in which the President directed that any enemy ships, Axis ships, located west of 20 West should be promptly reported and attacked. And this followed with other instructions, including painting the ship with war paint. Within hours, the crew turned to, and soon the Ingham wore her wartime coat of dark navy gray applied over her traditional white. The Ingham was then ordered from Portugal to the east coast of the United States for the purpose of having major armament changes accomplished. She was originally commissioned with the two 5-inch 51s forward as shown here, and two light 6-pounders on the third gun level. The war had shown the need for much heavier anti-aircraft armament than had previously been carried, and so one of the forward 5 inches was moved aft, and the two 6-pounders were removed, and two 3-inch 50 anti-aircraft guns were added forward. With war coming on, there was a little requirement for a float plane on the North Atlantic convoy routes because the water was simply too rough to operate one. That left the very roomy and broad quarterdeck open to install additional armament, and this was done during the refit. Here you see 3-inch 50 mounts being placed on sponsons built aft where the plane used to rest, and a 5-inch gun aft of that. And the aircraft crane is still in place at this time. However, it was soon removed, and a nest of 20mm guns installed just aft of the stack to give the ship more anti-aircraft firepower. Depth charge racks were installed aft to carry 600-pound depth charges. These were Torpex loaded. And then the racks were later extended to carry a greater quantity because experience soon showed that the only way to really ensure the destruction of the submarine was repeated attacks by depth charges. And then amidship, between the boats and the after 3-inch mounts, on either side were 3 K guns. These were mortar-like devices that threw a 300-pound depth charge 200 to 300 feet to either side, so that 3 lines of depth charges could be laid down in a pattern, one from the after depth charge racks, and then a row 300 feet to either side to cover a big enough area to ensure that the U-boat was within it. On completion of the armament change, the ship went to Casco Bay for trials of the new armament. And here you see the ship firing. Had a sleeve target, the 20mm nearest to you, and after that the 3-inch guns firing. And looking all the way to the stern, you can see the depth charge party standing by there. The 20mm Oerlikon gun, which was introduced to the fleet in 1942, was a vast improvement over the 50 caliber guns. It had used an explosive shell and proved highly effective against dive bombers. It's somewhat of a paradox that our finest light machine gun, the Oerlikon, was of Swiss design, and our best intermediate weapon was the 40 millimeter Bofors, and both of these guns were built by nations that are traditionally neutrals. The rugged and high endurance cutters were ordered to convoy duty sometime before Pearl Harbor. While we were still in a technical state of peace, United States escorts were escorting British convoys as far as Iceland, and as the situation worsened, they went even further. It was a undeclared state of war by the United States, and the Germans did not respond until the torpedo under the Reuben James, which was an understandable mistake by the U-boat commander, because the British were using 50 of the old four-pipe destroyers, of which the Reuben James was an identical class. After the outbreak of war, several of the cutters were ordered to Iceland, where they were based on Val Fjord, some 50 miles from the capital city of Reykjavik. It's a lonesome, wind-swept place, and there was nothing to do for recreation while you were in that anchorage, except go ashore to a Quonset hut, which was called an officers' club, which had plenty of whiskey at 15 cents a glass. This anchorage, desolate anchorage, was called by some Happy Valley, and by other sailors it was called Valley Forge. They claimed that the suffering at both of the Valley Forges were just about the same. Val Fjord offered very little protection from weather, and winds of 80 to 100 and even over 100 knots were very common there. We had a willy wall-like wind called a farm wind in Iceland, in which you would have a dead calm, and within a matter of 10 minutes the wind would be howling 80, 90, 100 miles an hour due to the cold air coming down out of the mountains. Here you see a Navy AK dragging into a cruiser, another cruiser in the background, and often when ships came into Val Fjord, they had to keep a watch on the bridge and keep turning their engines over slowly to relieve the pressure on the anchor chains. As bad as Val Fjord was, it really couldn't hold a candle to the open seas of the North Atlantic, and between November and April, the North Atlantic is a breeding ground of storms, and they hang on for days and weeks. Seas of 40 and 50 feet were not uncommon. The watches were stood in wet clothing, cold, ice. The ships often iced up when they moved up toward the Greenland area. And it was a thoroughly miserable existence for both the escort crews and the U-boat crews, and occasionally they just had to break off the fighting to try to cope with the weather. The men who manned the 327 footers were the luckiest of all the escort crews. These were the most rugged and the largest escorts to engage in the Battle of the North Atlantic until the coming of the escort carriers in late '43. Here is the Ingham during Convoy SC 121, plowing through heavy seas, and all of us who sail those ships can well remember when they would dip their bow into heavy seas with the seas coming all the way to the #2 gun platform, and then they would come rearing up with a forecastle full of water and dump it over the bridge where it ran down your neck. Nothing like 40-degree water running down the back of your neck to keep you alert. The men on the Old Navy four-pipers had it much worse. These were ships displaced about 1/2 the tonnage of Ingham. They were dated from World War I, very flimsy construction, and they were just miserable in a heavy sea. But other than the 327s, these old four-pipers were the only American escorts on the North Atlantic. The Navy had its eyes on the Pacific, and all the modern fleet destroyers were either sent to the Pacific or kept in port in Norfolk and Boston as escorts for the heavy units. Leary was one of our compatriots that often sailed with us, and she was torpedoed on Christmas Eve 1943 and went down with most of her crew. So the old four-pipers had very little survivability when hit. The little 165-foot corvettes, about 900 tons, were ubiquitous. They were probably the most numerous of the escorts in numbers. And they were designed from the pre-war whaling trawlers. Had a single screw, up and down piston engines, could do about 14 knots, carried one 4-inch gun and several machine guns and depth charges. They would have built in large numbers, many of them being built in Canada. They were manned by the Brits, by the Royal Canadian Navy, by the Free French and Norwegians, and this is the Lobelia, Free French corvette, and it was a real fighting ship. She sank 2 U-boats during the winter, and they were fighting Frenchmen in every sense of the word. Early on, the British found that the traditional dark gray was a very poor color for the North Atlantic, because at night, with the heavy white caps, those dark gray hulls stood out. And they found that by a camouflage coat of light blue, white, and light gray, that it blended in better with the white caps and the wind streaks on the water. So very shortly after I entered into the war, all the 327s were painted with this British camouflage. It also was hard to see when you had the northern lights, and on the North Atlantic crossing, we were working there north of 50 North, the ghostly northern lights really lit up the scene at night, and you felt like you were naked on a stage because you really stood out in the dark. The days before Pearl Harbor, the war was mostly confined to the Eastern Atlantic. The Germans, for operational reasons, figured they'd get better dividends there, but also the very bellicose attitude of the United States towards German vessels being in the Western Hemisphere caused the Germans to stay well to the east to avoid a direct confrontation. And this situation existed until the time of Pearl Harbor. You were unlikely to, in the pre-Pearl Harbor convoys that were being run by American ships to help the British, you were very unlikely to run into any U-boat activity to the west of Cape Farewell in Greenland. The situation changed very radically after the United States entered the war against Germany. Within a few weeks after our declaration of war, the Germans shifted their U-boats from the North Atlantic to the east coast of the United States, and they had a field day. They ran wild. We simply weren't prepared for it. Again, the Navy had its eyes on the Pacific, and for a while seemed to ignore the slaughter that was taking place along the East Coast. Finally, after 4 or 5 months of this slaughter, we did muster enough air and surface units and started a convoy system, at which time Admiral Durness, the U-boat CNC, moved his boats down into the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, and off the northeast coast of South America, where again they had what the Germans called the happy times, slaughter of Allied shipping. In the meantime, the North Atlantic was relatively calm, and but they did not withdraw any of the cutters or destroyers from the North Atlantic to help out in the crisis on the East Coast. In the fall of 1942, Durness began shifting his U-boats back to the North Atlantic due to the increased defensive measures along the American seaboard and in the Caribbean, and because he had decided that the North Atlantic, with its large convoys such as this, was a more rewarding target than the smaller coastal convoys. Furthermore, in the mid-Atlantic, it was what was known as the Greenland Air Gap, where aircraft from Newfoundland, Iceland, or England could not reach. So there was about 2 to 3 days cruising by a convoy in that area where no air cover was provided, and that is where the Germans waited in long patrol lines. As soon as the first convoy was sighted, they would send a radio message out to U-boat headquarters, and then U-boat command would order all of the boats in the patrol line to form a pack and attack. These attacks were U-boats had gathered around the convoy. They waited for night and would run in on the surface. And most of the actions of that winter of 42-43 were night actions, and they were fought out on the surface. The reason that Admiral Durness introduced these tactics, and he had experimented with it himself in the First World War as a young U-boat commander, was that with the low-lying silhouettes of the U-boats, they were very difficult to see. And whereas the large ships could be seen at night by an alert crew. And even after we got radar, the early SC-1 air search radars, which we had to use, were not very good at detecting small targets in heavy seas, and the Germans were able to see us by eye before we could see them on our radar. And of course, if we were both using only eyesight, they were certain to see us before we could see such a small object. The beginning of the winter onslaught occurred with convoy SC-107, which left New York and was attacked by 15 U-boats south of Greenland on the night of November the 4th, and the battle lasted for 4 days, during which the convoy lost 16 ships. Had a very weak escort, a Canadian escort, a 1 destroyer and 3 corvettes, and they simply weren't able to cope with it. One of the ships in that convoy was this ancient World War I freighter, which had been taken over by the Navy and designated by courtesy as an AK. You might get an idea of how desperate the Navy was for shipping, that they would send this vessel out into the North Atlantic in the winter. And what made it even worse was that they loaded aboard 250 passengers, including about a dozen Coast Guard officers going to Iceland to join the 327 cutters that were up there, and about 200 Army troops going to Iceland. On the second night of the attack, the Gemini was in column with 4 ships, and 3 of the 4 were torpedoed during the night, and Gemini strayed from the convoy and was running all by herself in the fog. Needless to say, we all thought that our time had come, but the only joke, and it was a black joke, was that the Germans simply were not going to waste a torpedo on the Gemini because a torpedo cost more than the ship. It was worth more than the ship. The 4th day of the attack, we received a radio message that Ingham, together with the destroyers Skink and Babbitt, were en route from Iceland to reinforce the escort, and of course everybody's morale went way up, that we were finally going to get some help out there, because we had everybody had just about given up hope. But that night, and they still hadn't joined yet, that night a ship in the port column was torpedoed, and everybody's hopes went down. We were going to be in for another night of slaughter. Almost immediately after the freighter and the port column was hit, however, the sky ahead of the convoy lit up with star shells, and it was Ingham and her task group coming in at full speed, and they saw the merchantman hit, and Commander George McCabe, the task unit group commander, ordered the ships to fire star shells, hoping to catch some of the U-boats on the surface, and also to divert the attention of the U-boats from the convoy. The ships of the reinforcement unit then took station on the outer screen a couple of miles ahead of the convoy, and allowed the Brits and Canadians to drop back to the inner screen, and we spent the rest of the night in peace, the first night's sleep we had had in 4 days. Early the next morning, McCabe took the Ingham up and down the lanes of the convoy as a show of force to encourage the merchant sailors and the people on the ships in the convoy. It's a sight I will remember to my dying, as that big gray ship came steaming down between the columns at 20 knots, her crew at battle stations, and her biggest American engine streaming out stiff in the breeze, about taking every third sea over the bow. And on the merchant ships, people cheered, threw their hats into the air, and tears were streaming down some weathered faces because we knew we were saved. The Americans were here. The cavalry had come. After the slaughter of SC-107, where 16 out of the 37 ships were lost, the tempo increased even further, and a long, bloody series of great battles were fought during that winter. The U-boats were seldom seen at night, and ordinarily the first warning we had was when a ship went up in flame. Theoretically, we should have been able to detect them with our sonar gear, but there were drawbacks. First, we only had 4 or 5 escorts to ring the convoy, which might be as much as 5 miles across the front. And the range of the sonar was only about 2,000 yards, and in very heavy seas, much less than that. So there were many gaps in the sonar coverage. The second was that in heavy seas, it was not very effective, a lot of water noise. So more often than not, the first notice we had that a U-boat was around was when a ship went up in flame like this. When a ship was hit, the escort commander would order Operation Raspberry Crack, in which all of the escorts would carry out a wheeling evolution and firing star shells. At the same time, all of the merchant ships in the convoy would fire mortar flares up. These were called snowflakes, and it would light up the whole convoy. The object being to detect any submarines that were on the surface running between the lanes of the convoy. After a tanker was hit, if the crew was lucky and the boats were not blown away and the flame did not spread too rapidly, the boats were lowered, and the crew went into the boats and pulled away and waited for an escort to come in and pick them up. The escorts, which were always too few in number, then had to make a choice between going after the enemy and going back and picking up our own people. More often than not, if the enemy was not in sight or no contact with them after the torpedoing, an escort would go back. And it was a very dangerous undertaking. It was accepted practice for one ship, one escort, to pick up survivors while another one circled it and protected it against another attack by the U-boat, which in all probability was somewhere within a mile or so after torpedoing the merchantman. The problem was that we often could not spare a second escort for the coverage. Therefore, you had to come and stop to pick up survivors with no cover, and you were at tremendous risk there. It was much riskier than attacking a U-boat. If you could get a boat launched, you had a very high probability of survival, because somebody was going to come back and look for you, if at all possible. And we made many pickups from boats such as this. The standard procedure was get upwind from it, stop your engines and drift down, and then throw over cargo nets for the merchant seamen to climb up. However, in February, after the British Newton Ash was torpedoed, we stopped at night and we drifted down on it, and they got a little panicky and tried to row towards us, and a big sea capsized them, throwing them into the water right along between the ship and the boat, and the next big wave, 20-foot seas running, took that boat and smashed it into the ship, crushing 15 or 20 people to death just below where we were reaching for them. I think we saved only 2 out of the 20-some-odd people in that boat. If you couldn't get into a boat, then the best bet was to get on one of the merchant marine type rafts. They were a box-like device and very bulky, and but as you can see here, where we're coming alongside to pick up survivors of the troop ship Henry Mallory, you get quite a few people on them, and the advantage of the merchant marine box type raft was that you could sit on it and have your core organs out of the water. You could survive quite a long time on it. They were, of course, very uncomfortable, but you could survive an extended period. Ingham picked up some Scandinavian sailors on one of these box-type rafts up at the Denmark Strait, and they'd been out there for several days, and shortly after being aboard, they were all in a rather good condition. As the winter progressed and the attacks increased, escorts coming in loaded with survivors was a very common sight. This is the Canadian corvette Arvida with many of the survivors from SC-107. And often we'd had so many survivors aboard that we would have to sleep hot bunks. That is, when the crewman of the ship was on watch, the merchant survivor could sleep in his bunk, but he had to get out when the watchstounder came back off watch. Sometimes there were no survivors at all. This is the SS Colmore, which was hit by 2 torpedoes in convoy SC-121, and the bib was sent back to look for it, or look for any survivors, and when they got there, they found the Colmore floating high and dry with 2 holes in her cargo holds, but nobody aboard. But they put the boarders aboard, and signs of a hurried abandonment. The crew apparently, after the hit, had quickly abandoned ship on 2 boats, and they were never seen again, although the bib and another escort searched for a good while looking for them. The ironic thing about this is that the tug was sent out from Ireland and towed the Colmore into the British Isles, and 25 years after the war, she was still sailing the oceans under the Panamanian flag, a ghost ship that had lost an entire crew. Whereas the U-boats generally avoid direct confrontation with the escorts because the merchantmen were much easier and more tempting targets, some escorts were a hit. This is the cutter Hamilton, one of the 327 footers, after being torpedoed south of Iceland. She had just thrown off a tow line after towing a Navy AKA, and before she could get underway, she was hit by a torpedo in the engine room, killing 20 people instantly, and 6 more died in the boats. Here you can see the crew getting ready to abandon ship. If you look to the right, you can see them loading the wounded into a boat. And then if you look further to the left, you see some of the crew in formation waiting in order to abandon ship. And in front of the formation is a donut-type raft ready to be launched. But in the cold January water, that was not much better than going down with the ship, because you weren't going to last more than 15 or 20 minutes. December the 15th, 1942, Ingham exacted her revenge for the loss of Hamilton, her sister's ship. She caught U-626 about 5 miles ahead of an eastbound convoy and attacked it, dropping 2 full patterns of depth charges. Here you see one of the K-guns firing, and you also see a depth charge from another K-gun in the air falling. In Ingham's attack, she dropped 8 charge patterns, mixture of 300-pounder and 600-pounders, and after the second attack, the contact was lost with the U-626. It was a new boat, been training in the Baltic, and departed Bergen, Norway only a week before, and on their first contact with an Allied convoy, they ran into Ingham and went down with all hands. They had a very short life. Ingham's claim to the kill could not be verified until German records were captured at the end of World War II, and the record showed that U-626 ceased all transmissions after making her contact report that night, and she now lies in mile-deep water in a position south of the Denmark Strait. A short while later, Campbell, Ingham's sister ship, in a night action with 4 U-boats, depth charged the U-626 and followed an attack by the Polish destroyer Berza and forced the U-boat to the surface. The Campbell then closed in, firing and with the intention of ramming if they had to. The last second, the U-boat was in a hard turn, and Campbell hit it a glancing blow, mortally wounding the submarine, but one of the submarine's diving fins cut a gash in the side of Campbell, and her engine room quickly flooded, and she was lying disabled. However, she did drop over a boat with a volunteer crew, and they went looking for the submarine, which also was lying dead in the water, sinking, and found it, came alongside, and took survivors aboard. It was an act of great humanity under very trying circumstances. Through the night and into the following day, the Polish destroyer Berza circled the crippled Campbell and protected her from further attack by U-boats. And finally, when their fuel was so short they had to depart, they took aboard about half of the Campbell's crew and left the other half of the crew to salvage the Campbell. The damage control party on Campbell rigged a cofferdam and to cut down on the flow of water, but the engineering spaces were badly damaged, and they still were unable to get underway. Finally, an ocean salvage tug arrived from Newfoundland, took the Campbell in tow, and towed it into the Maritimes for emergency repairs, and from there it proceeded to the States for a major overhaul. But her days on the North Atlantic were finished. Spencer, another 327, which was the flagship of American Group A3, caught a U-boat trying to get into a convoy, an eastbound convoy, and depth charged it ahead of the convoy. As you can see the depth charge exploding here, and notice that their port rack is already empty. The submarine then dived under the convoy to try to escape, and Spencer followed her through the lanes of the convoy, firing a Hedgehog, which is the new head-thrown rocket weapon, until they got astern of the convoy, and they depth charged it again, and the U-boat surfaced. Spencer and Duane, her sister ship, then opened fire at the surfaced U-boat with 5-inch and 3-inch, and quickly straddled and brought the U-boat to a stop with heavy damage. And launched a lifeboat with a salvage party who had been specially trained to try and salvage the U-boat. And Lieutenant Commander Ross Bullard, the gunnery officer of Spencer, managed to get aboard and into the conning tower, but the U-boat was settling rapidly, and he finally had to abandon the attempt. It was the first boarding of an enemy man-of-war at sea by an American since the War of 1812. After the U-boat sank, both Spencer and Duane began picking up survivors. Here we see one of the U-boat crewmen in his inflatable life jacket managed to keep his overseas cap on all the way through the ordeal. He's appears to be afraid they're going to leave him in the water, and he's being very vocal about it. One of the U-boat officers is being assisted by two of the American sailors. They were given a good treatment. Ordinarily, the Allies treated the Germans pretty well. They not too inexplainable when you figure that about 1/3 of all Americans are of German descent. Here is another U-boat crewman grabbing the cargo net. You can see his inflatable vest and the submarine escape lung that he's wearing. Here more crewmen being taken aboard, given blankets and hot coffee, and they afterwards praised the treatment that they received. After arriving in Greenock, Scotland, the prisoners were turned over to British military police. Their war was pretty well over. In fact, it was over. There were no escaping for the U-boat prisoners, and many of them were sent to Canada and kept in prison camps well on the interior in Saskatchewan and other remote places. In the background, you can see Spencer and Duane. All four submarines sunk by American escorts during the Bloody Winter were sunk by the Coast Guard 327-foot cutters. They had a kill ratio during the war of 0.8 submarines per ship, as contrasted with only 0.1 for the late arriving destroyer escorts and the fleet destroyers. 27s were the individually the most successful anti-submarine vessel of World War II, and it could be attributed to their high endurance and rugged sea-keeping capabilities. The fact that they had very experienced pre-war crews aboard during the Bloody Winter, and also they were where the action was. They were in great concentrations of U-boats, so they had ample opportunity to make contact. During that winter, we only ran one convoy in which we didn't make enemy contact, and that was one in January of '43 when the weather was so bad that both sides had to look after themselves in the weather. Weather often seemed to be a worse enemy than the Germans, especially when the convoys were routed well to the north. They'd take evasive routing action, and they route well to the north, right under the Greenland coast. And when they got out of the main axis of the Gulf Stream, and the cold air came down off the Greenland ice cap, it was necessary to go out with chipping hammers and clubs and get the ice off the guns. And conditions were miserable. Sometimes the seas were so bad you'd get flooding, especially on the old four-pipers. I've seen them come in with 2 feet of water in the wardroom. The escort sailors had very little protective clothing until late during the Bloody Winter. The standard uniform was what you see here with jungle cloth jackets and jungle cloth pants, and one thing that really helped out was the knit packages we got from the Red Cross with a scarf and a knit helmet, and that helped a lot. Finally, in March of '43, as a result of complaints from the fleet, they apparently took some of the sheepskin coats away from the storekeepers sitting in the Quonset huts ashore and hand them out to the fleet. By mid-February, the situation was desperate. We were losing over 100 ships a month. The fuel supplies for the Air Force in England were down to less than 4 weeks. We had very little time in port other than to come in for fuel and load depth charges and take on supplies. And even then, during the winter, the anchorage in Val Fjord was often like this. You couldn't put a boat over. You had to keep steam at the throttle and stand the watches on the bridge. The North Atlantic to the east of Iceland was under the control of Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches, Admiral Sir Max Horton, Royal Navy. Sir Max is shown here in his underground command bunker in Liverpool. He's in the middle. He's the middle man of the three standing in front, and they're looking at the convoy routes. The story is told on Sir Max that he once said to one of the aides, we either must route the convoys further south, or we must make the wrens wear pants. If you don't get that one, you might look up on the ladder where that wren is with the skirt. In any event, by the first part of March, the losses had become so heavy that some people in the Admiralty were considering abandonment of the convoys. Now, we now know that had that occurred, we probably would have lost the war. They would have severed the supply line to England. As it was, Churchill appealed to Roosevelt, and Roosevelt ordered 100 liberators diverted from the West Coast, where they were sitting around doing very little, to the Atlantic. The first escort carriers began to arrive about April of '43, and we began to get additional escorts, although the destroyer escorts did not arrive in numbers until well after the Battle of the Atlantic had been decided. Fortunately, the transfer of long-range liberators enabled us to close the Greenland air gap and provide some long-range coverage over most of the North Atlantic route. And this was further implemented when the first escort carriers got there, although they could not operate very well in the winter weather of the North Atlantic. But the turnaround in fortunes came very suddenly. In March, the Allies were in the depths of despair, and the Prime Minister, Mr. Churchill, ordered the home fleet to stop running convoys to Russia and to transfer destroyers from the home fleet down to Western Approaches to help out. And they formed up support groups which were able to go after the subs and stick with them until they were destroyed. By May, the slaughter of the U-boats began, and during the month of May, the Germans lost 29 submarines. And the losses were so shocking that Admiral Dönitz ordered all the U-boats back into France and French and German ports while he looked for a solution to the problem. And of course there was no solution, because there was an increasing number of Allied ships and planes and carriers out there looking for the U-boats. And it made Wolfpack operations impossible, because in order to operate as a Wolfpack, the U-boats had to spend a lot of time on the surface. They had to communicate by radio, which we could pick up, and it became impossible to operate as in Wolfpacks. Here you can get some idea of the losses on the North Atlantic during the bloody winter. Each cross marks a sunken merchant ship, and in some cases 2 or 3, and that marks the spot of an attack. The only comparable area during this period was off the northeast coast of South America, where there was very little in the way of Allied defenses. But the North Atlantic was where the heavy losses occurred. After the withdrawal of the U-boats and the termination of Wolfpack action, the Germans were pretty well reduced to operating singly as they had at the beginning of the war and in World War I. And the North Atlantic, where the convoys are now being run with heavy escorts, plenty of air cover, became a relatively safe place, as you can see by the number of attacks and losses from May, when the escort victory occurred, until the end of that year, until December 31st of 40. Very little action on the North Atlantic. One of the reasons was that the Germans were now on the defense. There were still men dying, but most of those dying were German. Another reason that the losses dropped so radically on the North Atlantic was not just the added forces that were escorting the convoys there, but the Allies started jumping the U-boats as they sailed across the Bay of Biscay from French ports to get to the North Atlantic shipping routes. Here is a chart showing the U-boats sunk by Allied air and surface forces while they were crossing the Bay of Biscay between May of 43 and the end of the year. And it was a veritable slaughter. The victory of the escorts in May, we had occasional losses, such as this tanker burning in a convoy, but the loss of one or two ships on the crossing was nothing like the terrible losses of 10, 12, and even 15 ships out of a convoy, which we experienced during the Bloody Winter. As a result, one result of this easing of the situation is that the Americans and Brits reached an agreement that the British and Canadian would take over the North Atlantic, and the Americans would take over the Central Atlantic between the States and the Mediterranean theater. All of the 327s were then assigned as task force flagships for the Norfolk to Gibraltar and Mediterranean runs, as far as Bizerti and Sicily. And the task force escorting these 80-ship convoys, mostly Liberty ships, which were coming off the ways in great numbers. You'd have 80 Liberty ships and merchantmen in the convoy. You'd have 10 or 12 DEs. You would have an escort carrier, and then you would have one of the cutters as flagship due to her endurance and room to carry a task force commander aboard. The runs across the Central Atlantic were pretty well milk runs in those days. There were some air attacks in the Mediterranean with the Luftwaffe coming down out of South France to harass the convoys, and there were isolated submarine actions in the Med, but generally it was nothing like the winter on the North Atlantic, and certainly the weather was a sharp contrast. With the submarines under firm control and plenty of escorts now available, it was decided to convert all of the 327-foot cutters to command ships, AGCs, amphibious command ships for the upcoming invasions. The first to be converted was Duane, shown here in the harbor at Naples, with the crew lining the rail, awaiting the arrival of King George VI of England for a visit. In July of 44, Ingham arrived at Charleston for her conversion, and she was in the Charleston Navy Yard for a couple of months having this conversion done, and it consisted of adding a good deal of deck house aft. All the ASW equipment was removed, and the deck house was extended well aft to accommodate the additional staff personnel who would be aboard. 5-inch 38s were mounted fore and aft, and twin and quad 40 millimeters. So although she had lost her ASW capability, she had a greatly increased anti-aircraft capability, which she would need during the invasions. The ship was a floating radio station. It had 42 receivers and 38 transmitters, and a third mast was put up to help carry the antenna for these radios. Here you can see the tremendous number of coaxes leading up and antennas leading up to the mast there. Arrived in the Pacific in early 1945, and she was engaged in 9 assault landings in the Philippines. She was flagship for the recapture of Corregidor, and here she's shown off the island just after the surrender of the Japanese garrison remaining on Corregidor. At the end of the war, she became the flagship for the South China Naval Forces, and was in Hong Kong, Shanghai, and then in 1946, early 46, she was ordered back to the States to be converted back as a Coast Guard vessel. This conversion was carried out at the Charleston Navy Yard, and she emerged with her near original lines, pre-war lines. She had reduced gun armament. She had a 5-inch 38 and 40 millimeters and Hedgehog. Later, torpedo tubes were, anti-submarine torpedo tubes were added. But the ship was primarily to be engaged until the time of the Vietnam War in ocean station duty, providing beacon service and weather for the increasing transocean airline traffic. But while she was on this duty, she engaged in a number of rescues. Here she noses up to a Navy oceanographic ship which had suffered a bad boiler room explosion, and is preparing to put a firefighting party aboard. Up ahead you can see a Coast Guard fleet tug pouring water on the sides of the ship to try to keep it cool so that the fuel does not ignite and explode. Episode, returning from Ocean Station, she picked up a badly injured German seaman several hundred miles from Bermuda, and radioed in for an aircraft to come and evacuate him because of his condition. The PBM was sent from Elizabeth City, and after arriving, the ship put over a boat with the injured seaman in it, and we put 2 of our air crewmen in a rubber raft and took him aboard there. We didn't want a boat alongside because it might knock the hole of the seaplane, and we brought him back to the States after making open sea takeoff with JATO. In 1968, Ingham was ordered to Vietnam as part of Coast Guard Squadron 3 of large ships, and she spent over a year there, constantly in action. Due to its high endurance, the ship could stay at sea much longer than the destroyers, and by replenishing at sea, she was able to stay on station a big percentage of the time. Her primary assignment in Westpac in Vietnamese waters was Operation Market Time, which was the interdiction of communist supplies coming down to the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army fighting in the south. Here you see a boarding party examining a small coastal freighter, checking the cargo, and these cutters boarded hundreds of vessels, most of which, of course, were friendlies and were not carrying illicit cargo or contraband, but they did almost completely stop the flow of munitions and supplies by sea. Ingham also engaged in a large number of gunfire support missions, supporting the Army ashore. Here you see her shells hitting ashore while the bridge people are watching and spotting. She landed raiding parties. She gave support to the 82 footers of Squadron 1 and to the Navy's swift boats operating up the rivers. While she was in port, her doctor and medical team went ashore and helped the native population by rendering medical care. As she left to return to the States after a year in off Vietnam, she came back with 2 Presidential Unit citations, the only Coast Guard ship to ever win 2, and one of the few United States ships to ever win 2. She also had the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry and other Vietnamese awards for humanitarian service. It was a job well done. After returning to the States, Ingham and the other ships of Squadron 3 were ordered into the drug war, which during the Vietnam War, the use of drugs increased radically, and most of the supply was coming up from Central and South America. Here you see Ingham, to the right of the picture, has stopped a ketch, and the boarding party is aboard searching for contraband. The ships managed to cut about half of the marijuana supply coming into the States, but cocaine was much more difficult because it could be concealed in hard to find places, special compartments, and the smugglers had almost an unlimited treasury to fund equipment and new ways of evading the patrols. The fight against the drugger runners was momentarily halted when the mass exodus of political refugees from Cuba began to stream across the Florida Straits from Mariel. Literally hundreds of boats, many in very poor condition and nearly all overcrowded, were making their way from Mariel to the States. And the President ordered the Navy and Coast Guard to go down and attempt to control the situation. And during this exodus, Ingham rendered help to dozens of boats and ships and took aboard hundreds of people. At the conclusion of the Mariel exodus, Ingham was awarded a Coast Guard Commandant's Unit Commendation. The exodus of Cuban refugees triggered a similar exodus from Haiti. Although the Cuban refugees were called political refugees and the Haitians were called economic refugees, and the Haitians were denied blanket entry into the States. The Coast Guard was ordered to stop this illegal immigration, and they set up patrols in the Caribbean and between Haiti and the States to intercept the boats coming in. boats, small boats as small as 50 and 60 feet, had up to 200 people living in appalling conditions. Many were lost at sea. We still have no track of vessels that just disappeared completely because the Haitians kept no records. The people who were trying to escape, there were entrepreneurs who were providing these old craft, and the refugees were treated in a manner that would have made a 17th century slaver turn pale. By 1988, Ingham was the only one of the seven sisters left. And after just finishing a major overhaul, a budget crisis occurred and she was ordered decommissioned. And she was then put out of service in May of 1988 in ceremonies at her longtime home port of Portsmouth, Virginia. The ship at her decommissioning was in beautiful condition and reflected the great care that her present crew had taken with her and the hard work they had put into it, and her decommissioning came as a surprise to all hands. At the decommissioning ceremonies, Captain John Waters, who was the first president of the Ingham Association, spoke of the history of the ship, and he was followed by Admiral Dease Thompson, Vice Admiral Dease Thompson, the commander of the Coast Guard Atlantic area, who reviewed many of the accomplishments of the ship in the days after World War II. The ceremonies were attended by several hundred supporters, friends, and former crew members of Ingham, and the ceremonies were very moving and impressive. There were many tears in the eyes of the old veterans from the ship as her colors came down from the last time and were carried ashore. Among those saying farewell to the ship was the daughter of Competent Lieutenant Carp of U-626, who in January of 1943 fired two torpedoes at Ingham in very rough seas and missed. Carp himself was killed several months later. It seemed appropriate when his daughter was meeting with us. She said that she certainly was glad her father didn't hit the ship because there were such nice people on it. After her decommissioning, the Congress granted custody of the Ingham to the Patriots Point Naval and Maritime Museum at Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, which also has the carrier Yorktown, seen here in the background, and the destroyer Laffey. The arrival of Ingham at Patriots Point marked the culmination of a 6-year effort by the Ingham Association to preserve the ship. A number of the World War II veterans of the ship, clad in the uniform of the day, rode Ingham on her last trip across Charleston Harbor to her final docking place at Patriots Point. In October of 1990, after a year of preparatory work by the Museum at Patriots Point and the members of the Ingham Association, the ship was formally opened to the public at the 4th annual reunion of the Ingham Association. Fourth biannual reunion, I should say. The ship was in excellent condition. The paint looked, had a nice paint coat. All the equipment was delivered with the ship. And the impression of numerous Coast Guard and Navy veterans who visited the ship is that this is what an active ship looks like. It looks like she could get underway. Over 300 members of the Ingham Association and their friends and relatives were aboard for the opening ceremonies and for the memorial service. Reunion. All the old veterans had a chance to visit their watch stations and battle stations, as these members of the Black Gang are. The engine room is looks in immaculate condition, and as though the ship could get underway, which it could if anyone would raise steam. On her last full power run, going to New York after her decommissioning, she came within 17 RPM of her design speed of 52 years before. A year and a half later, it's now February 1992, to see all of the big changes that have been made. The ship looks extremely good. There's not much sign of deterioration, if any, and many improvements. As I come over the gangway here, and I'm looking at two people waiting for me, going to go around the ship on the tour, that have contributed so much to it. There's Buddy Sturgis, who's been the curator since the ship got here, and there's Abner Dare. We all know Abner. He was a chief machinist mate on the ship, lives here in Charleston, and he's down here, he and his wife, several times a week working. And these two people are two of the primary people responsible for the condition of the ship now. So we're going to continue, and we'll go down, pass on to the quarterdeck, and then down into the wardroom country, and we'll start aft and work our way. Now we are going to start our tour in the just after the wardroom country, back in the stern, and we're looking at the laundry room, and there's where we passed our trousers. We were not sloppy sailors. We were often wet sailors and cold sailors, but when we got ready to go to shore, we looked pretty good. Forward a little, we look at one of the damage control lockers. This is in the wardroom country, and all the gear is here just like it was when the ship last sailed. And here you see firefighting gear, other damage control gear. We learned early in World War II that you'd better be able to control the damage or you're going to lose the whole ship. And all this gear is still aboard. They had a personal note here. This is the room, state room, Lieutenant J.G. John M. Waters, who was the watch officer and gunnery officer on the ship from 42 to 44, and I can't imagine I was in such a small place for 2 whole years, but it seemed like a lot at the time. Well, looking at the executive officer's stateroom, he and the engineer had the roomiest staterooms, of course, and he's doing what all execs spend a lot of their time doing. He's doing paperwork. Got his cup of coffee there, and sometimes when you got summoned to this room, you were in deep trouble. Inside the stateroom, you see a plaque, a memorial to Lieutenant Commander Sidney Porter, who was our exec on the North Atlantic, and he was killed in action January 1943. He's out of the class of 1930. Fine man. Now looking at the wardroom of the ship, and a couple of the officers there, this wardroom was somewhat different from what it was in World War II. One thing that we didn't have was that television, and you'll notice that both of the officers who are in the wardroom are wearing Bender blues, which came in right around 1970. Before that, informal wear was khakis. Now looking at the other half of the wardroom, the port side, we see the serving counter, the coffee, which is always there, and the table set for chow. In rough weather, we had to put boards on there to hold the dishes. And there is the pantry, the opening to the officers' pantry. The officers ate their own mess separate from the crew, and at the end of the month they totaled up the total cost of the mess and divided it evenly between all the officers. World War II, our mess bill was about $8 a month. Officers' galley. Ordinarily, we had about 4 or 5 Filipinos worked in here. They very seldom ate the officers' food. It was their choice. They would never give up their rice and fish in order to eat a nice big steak. Of course, they probably live longer. As you can see, we're now at the Chief Petty Officer's quarters, which were just forward of the wardrobe. And we've got a couple of the chiefs in here. The chief who is sitting down has on the navy blues, which they wore until 70, and the chief standing by the refrigerator has on the Bender blues. Both of those guys didn't take care of their hair, but they will shortly. This is the first-class petty officer's berth. A little more privacy and fewer people, of course, than you got forward. You'll notice they've got curtains on the bunk. That's a privilege we didn't have in First War, or rather World War II. Here's a shore patrolman getting ready to go ashore with his leggings and the flat hat and his nightstick. Didn't need them too much, but when you needed a nightstick, you really needed it. Now we are in the sick bay, and you see the doctor coming through, been doing some procedures, got on his headgear and gloves and all. There's an x-ray waiting to be read. All the supplies are here just like they were when the ship was decommissioned. Nothing's changed. And at this point I want to let one of the visitors, while we were doing this series, came aboard and told us about how his life was saved in this sick.
Down in the tree. I was shot down. We got hit with some type of fire and shot the chopper down, and we managed to land in the water to keep from going down in the trees. And the next thing I knew, I was on this cutter, and I was being treated here in this sick bay. And I believe today that if it hadn't been for that quick treatment that I got while on this cutter, before being transferred to hospital ship, I believe I'd have lost my leg, because I eventually had to have a knee joint put in. But the way I was losing blood and all, and as bad a shape as I was in at the time, I firmly believe that they saved my life on me.
Well, that's a real interesting story. What is your name, sir? Where do you live?
My name is John Bayless. I live in Kings Mountain, North Carolina now.
Well, John, we're awful glad that the Coast Guardman on Ingham off Vietnam could help you. It's good to see you here. Bring your friends back and show them where you were.
Thank you.
As we step up the bill first, all the notices on the bulletin boards, and down below you see the timbers that were used for shoring up bulkheads in case of damage. And these bulletin boards have got the same notices that were on there when the ship was decommissioned in May of 1988. We've preserved everything just like it is, and hope it'll be like that 50 years from now, that a whole new generation unborn will be able to come and see how we all lived then. Up forward you see the blowers, which are still operate. They'll keep the ship cool, relatively cool in the summer. Passageway forward alongside the engineering spaces, where they're able to work from fore and aft without getting on the weather deck, which in many cases was absolutely necessary. But when the ship was at battle stations, all these doors were closed, so you had to go up and over. You notice that the cans of foam for firefighting are still there. Here we're looking at the hatchway leading down to the fire room, the boiler room, and on here is a memorial to the 26 men of the Alexander Hamilton, the sister ship, who were killed when she was hit by a torpedo. This memorial plaque was donated by Admiral Ed Allen, who is the assistant engineering officer, and he was due for a meeting in the ship's office at the time of the attack, and he was a little delayed in the wardroom, and everyone who was waiting in the office was killed. And you see, he was very fortunate that 30 seconds later, he would have gone with them. We're now on the walkway looking down into the engine room, and engine room is just in mint condition. If you look a little closer down here, you'll see one of the machinist mates working on the turbine there, and there's a watch officer. Above the engine room, you can see the diagram of the propulsion plant. The Ingham was the last ship in the Coast Guard to be propelled by steam. Everything now is gas turbine and diesel. But I might mention that on her last run, after she was decommissioned and on her way to New York for further disposal, she had a full power run. She came within 17 RPM of her design speed 52 years before. Looking aft at the turbines, and the watch officer or warrant officer on watch. I noticed that somebody stole his cap emblem, but we guess we'll get that replaced. Electrical switchboard to control the very intricate electrical system throughout the ship. Well, here's our old friend Abner there at the same station he was at over 50 years ago. Abner, you're not making much progress there. 50 years doing the same job. But that's the ship, the one, the throttle to the starboard engine he's at. And when you wanted to back down, you had to close down the throttle to the head turbines and then open up the throttle to the astern turbines. You couldn't stop thinking in back it the other way. You had to use a head turbine and a separate back-end turbine. And of course, here's all the instruments that you use to control it. And right in front of you might point out the engine room telegraph. The bridge would send a signal to the engine room telegraph, and it would be acknowledged by the right there. You'd be acknowledged by the engine room, and they would execute. Here we are again, looking forward through the engine room, and this thing is in beautiful condition. If we just get steam up on the boilers, the ship could get underway. After the engine room is the auxiliary. Up there you see the condensers that made fresh water. Up close here are more of the auxiliary machinery. On either side of the engine room you have the ship service generators, big powerful diesel-driven generators, steam-driven generators that produce the ship's power. And this would be producing enough power to run a small city. Of course, when you had flooding in the engine room, as you did on the Hamilton and on the Campbell, then you have no power at all to the ship, and the ship just doesn't work. We're getting ready to go down to the fire room, the boiler room, and we're looking almost vertically down. Let me bring it down to give you an idea. Go way down below the water line, and here were those guys during battle stations down there with 500 pounds per square inch steam, and it's superheated to 600 degrees. To get out there, they had to come up this vertical ladder, so it was not a very safe place to be. Yeah, we've had temporary failure of the lights here in the boiler room. We'll get a look at the boilers anyway. Here you see the port boiler, and here are the 3 nozzles that feed atomized fuel oil into them. When you change speed over a certain range, you had to insert new, what do you call those things, Abner? New
burner tips.
Burner tips in there. Here's Abner. Pull it out, Abner. Let me look at that boiler tip, okay? And they had to put a new tip on there when you had a different speed, so you atomize fuel at a different rate. Okay, now here's some of the control instruments for the boiler room. And we just noticed that somebody has got into here and dumped some stuff out onto the deck. I don't know how in the world anyone can ever get down here, but it shows that the public is absolutely ingenious at getting into the locked spaces. Now looking at the mess deck, this was somewhat different from what it was when I was aboard in World War II, and we used to have movies that were shown on that bulkhead. Used to go to sea with about 3 movies, and they were grade B to start with. And before we got back in, usually 3 or 4 weeks, we will have seen them 3 or 4 times. They turn off the sound and let the crew supply the dialogue, which would have been rated X. Here's the Christmas menu for Christmas 1942. The ship was in Valfjord, Iceland. You can see there the mountains in the background. We just got into Valfjord the 2 days before Christmas, and we had sunk U-626 about 8 days before that.
Leak down here.
We're now looking in one of the forward seaman berths. They've got some little privacy these days. Got a curtain hanging up and a little more room between bunks, but it was much more Spartan back in the early days. You see a seaman's locker, and that one locker, he had to carry all of the gear that he owned in there to last him for a year. Had to be carried right in that one locker. He also had a sea bag locker below decks where he could put the stuff he didn't immediately need. Just below the main berth deck, one deck down below, we had the brig. It was used occasionally when you had somebody come back aboard and got a little drunk and wild. He couldn't control him. He'd lock him up till he sobered up. One time come back from North Africa, we had 2 homosexuals that the Army had convicted and were sending back to the States. They were locked up there. Shows how the times have changed. And we had a fellow over in the Pacific named Balsley tried to smuggle booze aboard. They put him there for 5 days on bread and water, and we'll see what the results were. Well, today we can't find the key to it, but anyway, that's the ship's brig, and the end result of Balsley's staying there was that the boys sneaked food to him and he came out 4 pounds heavier. And the sequence on that thing 45 years later is that he and the skipper, Carl Zettel, played golf together at one of the reunions here. But inside that there, if we can find out, there's the buck there, and there's a skeleton in there that was donated by the College of Medicine at the University of South Carolina. The Ingham Museum on the main berth deck. Main berth deck was emptied of bunks and lockers, and this is where we have the museum now. You walk along, the pictures are in more or less chronological order of the life of the ship over 52 years, and one of the finest collection of pictures, marine pictures over that period that exist. Both actual action photos and paintings by Otto Fischer, who was a Coast Guard Lieutenant Commander during the war and probably the greatest marine artist of the 20th century. Here are a couple of his paintings. And here are 2 more. And as we walk along through the museum deck, we see pictures of the North Atlantic action, the sinking of U-175 by Spencer. Here are pictures of in the Mediterranean. There's the ship's company after the battle, or the officers rather, after the battle of SC-122, greatest convoy battle of all times. Go over to the Mediterranean operations. Some of the boys in North Africa. And then after the conversion to an amphibious ship, she went to the Pacific and engaged in numerous campaigns. There are a list of her campaigns in the Pacific, including the capture of Corregidor. And this one you see Ingham off Corregidor the day Corregidor fell. And after the fall of Corregidor, you see here General MacArthur coming ashore at Corregidor. Have her post-war peacetime operations, search and rescue, ocean station duty. In 1968, she was deployed to Vietnam, back to war again. These are some of the pictures of actions off of Vietnam. There were also humanitarian duties there. They often, when they were in port, would treat Vietnamese children. And then the Marielle Sea Lift, she picked up hundreds of people in that. And then on to the drug interdiction until her decommissioning in 1988. Decommissioned at Portsmouth, and then from there she was towed to New York, and the Congress turned it over to the state of South Carolina. In case we have a cadet in full dress uniform. The ship was used as a cadet training ship, 3 or 4 cadet cruises. And here is pre-World War II full dress frock coat uniform. They wore those things until 1941. Used for formal visits to other ships. And here is a chief petty officer in grays, which came along about 1943 and were called Ernie King Grays. They were rather drab uniform, were not very popular. Now missing temporarily is a sailor in the pre-war dress whites with the blue collar. He'll be put back in. He had to have his uniform pressed. Now going to the port side of the museum, and here this is devoted to Coast Guard destroyer escorts in the combat veterans section. There's the engine room telegraph and the wheel off the USS Merrill, the Coast Guard DE, and some more memorabilia. Here is a picture of the bib rescuing the people from the Bermuda Sky Queen, one of the great air-sea rescues of all times. Back in the Coast Guard DE section again, there is the Leopold, which was the first American destroyer escort lost, and with most of her crew. I knew her skipper well, and a classmate of mine, Bob Westcott, was killed on her. The Coast Guard battle colors, honors rendered, worn with the flag. A display of Coast Guard destroyer escorts in action. The sinking of a U-boat by USS Joyce, Coast Guard DE. And in the combat veterans, we see a Coast Guard AK. And as we move along, we see some landing craft. Coast Guard manned hundreds of landing craft and amphibious craft. Here are the models built by Tony Koska, carpenter's mate from World War II, of the Ingham as she was in the Battle of the Atlantic, as she was as an amphibious flagship in the Pacific, and as she was in Vietnam. In this display case just below is the quartermaster's bridge book of the ship during the invasion of Corregidor. There are her battle honors, and here is the Chinese flag. It was made up by the ship's quartermasters to be flown when the ship entered Shanghai at the end of the war, and they had to have a Chinese flag to enter in what was now Chinese nationalist port. This display case is of our ship's doctor, Doc Smith, and his shoulder boards and stethoscope, but the big thing is his diary. Doc was the ship's censor, and he kept a diary. You weren't supposed to, but he kept one, and it's very revealing of the times in which we lived then. Doc died about 2 years ago. A fine man, very popular with the crew. Just above that case is my favorite painting by Fisher, which shows a 327 early in the war cutting through the columns of a convoy. In the ship's office, and here you've got the ship personnel officer giving a set of leave papers to a sailor going on leave. The officer is in Bender Blues, the present uniform, and the sailor is in the Navy Blues, which were worn up until 1970. Cabin where the captain, the commander, is sitting at the table with an admiral. The ship was often served as a flagship and did carry flag officers aboard. And we look around the cabin, it's just like it was when the last captain stepped off of it. His own pantry, and there's the opening into the pantry where the captain's steward fixed his meals. Back here's the captain's bunk room or bedroom bunk, and there's the head. Plaque in the captain's cabin showing all the men who have commanded Ingham during her 52-year career. On the bridge of the ship is the officer of the deck with a sealed hat on, so I assume we're in a general quarters situation. There's the engine room telegraph operator, and here's the helmsman. They're wearing various uniforms that we wore. This one's dungarees, the other was undress blues. And the OD should have a life jacket. Radar, you got plenty of radars back aft in Combat Information Center, but OD likes to have one that he can look at. Engine room telegraph operator, your various bridge controls, radios, internal communications, alarms. The galley, I guess we'll have to call this the Cutting Memorial Room in honor of our old shipmate Dick Cutting, one of our better-known cooks. They could cook up about anything in here, bread, hot bread. Look at the tubs there that they made vegetables and soup in. You needed big vats because you're feeding 250 people. Staff of the bridge. Here's the navigator's compartment where he plotted his fixes and navigation data. There's a sextant. That was our primary reliance then. Now we've got all kinds of electronics, and sextant's kind of a backup. We're looking at the Combat Information Center. All the radars, the sonar equipment, everything back there, the nerve center of the ship. And they advised the captain and to tell him what's happening, plot the other targets. Ordinarily, you've got 3 men on watch. Now it's a cruising watch. You see the radar man sitting in the back. But at general quarters, probably 8 or 10 people in here. Nerve center of the ship. With that, we conclude our walk around on the ship. Got a pretty good idea about how she is a couple of years after arriving here. I think they've done a fine job of keeping it up. Hope she's kept up in this condition for future generations. Ground is the destroyer Laffey, the ship that would not die. She shot down 14 kamikazes on the picket line at Okinawa and was hit 4 times, and her entire after turret was destroyed with people in it. And as we come around, we see the USS Yorktown, the Fighting Lady. And so you've got 3 famous ships here together. You've got the Yorktown, got a Presidential Unit Citation, the Laffey with a Presidential Citation, and then you look down on Ingham with 2 Presidential Unit Citations, which at the time of her retirement was the most decorated ship in the fleet. Of battle honors such as Ingham carries, from her pre-war assignments to the numerous North Atlantic convoys during the Bloody Winter and the battles she fought, the submarine she sank, the Mediterranean convoys, the Pacific operations and her battle stars in the Pacific, the Vietnam operations and battle stars, and finally, her citations. 2 Presidential Unit Citations, Philippine Republic Presidential Citation, Republic of Vietnam Meritorious Unit Citation, Republic of Vietnam Meritorious Cross, and Coast Guard Meritorious Unit Commendation. At the time she was retired from service, Ingham was the oldest and most decorated ship in the United States fleet. 1 enemy vessel sunk, 10 drug vessels seized, 19 citations and campaign ribbons, and 11 battle stars. Well done, old girl, as we turn you over to our children, our grandchildren, and posterity.